Hi, John.
Hello, Meenakshi. How are you?
I'm doing good. Would you like to just try sharing your screen so we can just make sure that everything is going?
Give me a second. Just going to try, and I might move off and on along the way. So I'm just going to. I got this. Yeah, 1 second. I got the other. Give me. That work?
Hello. Yeah, that worked. Can you make sure that it's on the, you put it on the slideshow play so it covers the screen as we are recording? Thank you so much. Yeah, you can stop sharing and let me we're just doing a quick round of introductions of people around at the call, and then we will follow up with your talk if that's okay with you, John. Thank you. So can I call on Vijay Kumar to introduce yourself?
Good evening. Myself Vijay Kumar from Rotary Club of Etoda. I used to continue attend this program over here. Actually, I am from District 3292, and I am the region chair of Region 6, which covers 15 clubs. It is very interested. I would like to have circulate some our friends over this and for upcoming this Environment Day. Thank you very much.
Nagjyoti?
Myself, Rotarian Nagjyoti Bullaprada. I am a ESRAG South Asia member. Thank you very much and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining.
Ramesh Agarwal, if you could introduce yourself.
Thanks, Meenakshi. I'm past Governor Ramesh Agarwal. I'm the Executive Director with ESRAG, and I'm glad to be here. Of course, I'm a little bit late, but good to be with every one of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary Abraham, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Mary Abraham. I'm from London, District 1090, and my club is Beaconsfield, closer to Heathrow Airport.
Thank you.
And I'm part of Environment Project. And
you have one of the best film and TV production unit colleges over there in Beaconsfield, don't you?
Yep.
Okay. Rutuja?
Hi, I am Rutuja, and I am Professor John's student.
Okay, nice to have you here.
Hi, I'm Ruth. I was in college with John Mathew.
Okay, hi. I missed anyone, and anyone who would like to introduce themselves, please take this opportunity.
I'm Nirmala Raghavan from Chennai, RID 3232.
Great. Welcome.
I am N. Ramakrishnan from Bangalore. I'm a retired computer professional, spending all my time in educating people on gardening, composting, and rainwater harvesting.
Welcome. Welcome.
Hello. Good evening. I'm Professor Shabirnath, a retired professor of commerce from Rotary Club of Haripad in RI District 3211. I'm an active Rotarian. Now I am the general coordinator for the Rotary Joint Project Action Team.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good evening. I am Deepak Raj Vandari, District 292 from Nepal. Glad to be here looking for this program.
Thank you.
I am Sasi Dacholia from Rotary Club of Calcutta Metropolitan, District 3291.
Rotarian Anshu Verma from Rotary Club of Navi Mumbai Garima, District 3142. And happy to be part of this meeting. Thank you.
Okay. Today being the World Biodiversity Day, Arun and I decided the best person to talk to us today would be John. Known John for quite some time when we both were doing our graduate studies in the US. John did his bachelor's, master's, and master in philosophy from Madras Christian College in Chennai. He also has an additional master's in medical anthropology from Harvard University. And he also has 2 doctorates, one in ecology from Old Dominion University in Virginia, and another in the history of science from Harvard. He enjoys teaching anthropology, biology, geology, history, and history of science. And for people who do not know him, he is very interested in music and has directed musicals in the past. And the first being Olive. That was your first one, isn't it, John? I think that was his first one. Currently, he is teaching at the Krea University, and he is in the process of revising a book-length manuscript to fashion a fauna for British India, which is going to be published by OUP. He is also researching plague and influenza epidemics in India through the 1890s and early 1918 to 20. It's my pleasure to welcome John to address us on World Biodiversity Day. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Meena. Thank you all very much for being here and greeting all on World Biodiversity Day. And it's thank you, dear family and friends that are here as well. And I must say that the last time I had anything active to do with the Rotary in any form was when I participated for my school stains for the local Kunur chapter in the Nilgiris, and that was at the ages of 13 and 14. So it's been nearly 40 years since, so it's good to be able to do this again. So what I'm going to try and do is to start, I'm going to show a couple of snippets along the way. And one issue, Meenakshi, is if I do go to full screen, I can't see what the next slide is. Let me see what I can do here. All right, is this good, or do I need to go to full screen? You tell me, Meena. I can't hear you.
Hey, that's good. You can go on as it is.
Go on, as it is.
All right, so let me just, okay. So what happened and how we got here? And this is what was produced. So thank you, Arun, for doing this, and for that lovely beginning. But what I'm going to do to start is to go to 2016 and look at Paris, the Paris agreements, and let's look at some of these elements to save and increase forest area, to capture greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, make finance consistent and aligned with agreement goals, hold average increase in global temperature to degrees centigrade, limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade, and increase the ability to adapt to climate change. So this is what we have in Paris 2016. Then let's come to this, which is the UN Climate Change Conference in UN 2021. What's the outcome of that? We've got Alok Sharma, president of the conference, the party COP. And I just want to stop this for a second and show this. And see if I can share this. Can you see this? Can you see this?
Yeah.
I just say
we
to
can.
all delegates, I apologize for the way this process has unfolded, and I'm deeply sorry. I also understand the deep disappointment, but I think, as you have noted, it's also vital that we protect this package.
Right, so what's going on over there? This is something that I did want to speak about in particular. One second. Close this. And this is Alok Sharma, part of the Tory government, but making an impassioned, concluding a set of comments And this is largely because they couldn't agree on a number of these particular points that were raised earlier at Paris. Now, was the world going to move off coal? Was it going to phase out or phase down? India and China were the major holdouts in this regard. And Alok Sharma actually said that you are now responsible, and with the case of India, for example, to a place like this, which is the Maldives. And you can actually see just how high that the water is, in relation to its capital, Mahi. And this is from last year. But there have been voices in between. There's been Greta Thunberg, for example, who famously at the climate summit in 2019 continued to say, "How dare you?" And Seven Colors Suzuki, a full, nearly 30 years before the real conference in 1992, said, "What are you doing to us? You're the children." And it seems as though very little had actually changed. But in between, we had this. We had the World Summit on Sustainable Development. And here's Robert Mugabe, no great friend of the North in many ways, and with very questionable decisions. But I will, and I wanted to show you something which he said, and I think this is going to be significant. And perhaps we can think about this from the perspective of what sometimes thorny and occasionally intractable situations can be. And this is Mugabe 10 years after Rio 1992.
Your Excellencies, we must examine why 10 years after Rio, the poor remain very much with us, poorer and far more exposed and vulnerable than ever before. Our children suffer from malnutrition, hunger, and diseases, compounded now by the deadly HIV/AIDS pandemic. The betrayal of the collective agenda we set ourselves at Rio is a compelling manifestation of bad global governance, lack of real political will by the North, and a total absence of a just rule of law in international affairs. But they would want, indeed, ours is an agrarian economy, an imperative that renders the issue of access to land paramount. In our situation, Mr. President, this fundamental question has pitted the black majority, who are the right holders and therefore primary stakeholders to our land, against an obdurate and internationally well-connected racial minority, largely of British descent, and brought in and sustained by British colonialism, now being supported and manipulated by the Blair government. We have said, even as we acquire our land, we shall not deprive the white farmers of land completely. Every one of them is entitled to at least one farm, but they would want to continue to have more than one farm. More than one farm indeed. 15, 20, 35 farms, one person. These are not figures I am just getting out of my mind. They are real figures. So no farmer is being left without land. Let no one who is negative want to spoil what we are doing for ourselves in order to unite Africa. We belong to this continent. We don't mind having and bearing sanctions banning us from Europe. We are not Europeans. We have not asked for any inch of Europe, or any square inch of that territory. So, Blair, keep your England and let me keep my Zimbabwe. Mr. Chairman, having said that, may I say, people must always come first in any process of sustainable development. And let our Africans come first in the development of Africa. not as puppets, not as beggars, but as a sovereign people. I thank you.
Now, it might seem, okay, so what I'm going to do is, I got that down, 1 second. And the reason I've actually done this is to indicate some of the really thorny situations when we come to speak about aspects of the environment, not least biodiversity. And this is where, are you having trouble seeing the slides? Anybody?
No, it's clear.
Noted? Good, okay. And I wanted to go to global pacts, global problems, even as we talk about biodiversity, because it is indissolubly associated with every one of these other aspects to which I'm drawing attention, climate change being always very much part of that spectre which we have to consider. Now, this is quite different, of course, from inspirations. And the way I thought I'd frame this is to start with those global issues and say starkly what is here, and then come to some of those inspirations that got me really interested in this and tell you something of my own journey. And what I've also done is to scour my lectures. I teach at Krea University right now, and I teach among history, biology, and environmental studies. And I scoured my lectures to see what it was that I was teaching, to bring this together in many ways and talk about what impels those decisions. This is one of the slides that I used. What I was reading when I was a teenager and then in college, as I moved on to stories from like Joy Adamson's and Gerald Durrell, The Naked Ape, Desmond Morris, and then moved on as I started studying birds over here first, sea turtles. Amina's already drawn attention to this, I'll come to this along the way. And when I moved later to the United States, entomology, and as you can see, the ants. Over here, Gorillas in the Mist. Many of you will recognize a number of these titles. The author of this particular book becomes important because Edward O. Wilson, who died earlier this year. I mean, he was very responsible, of course, for initiating the field of sociobiology, now seen in terms of evolutionary psychology, the term still largely used but he did this in the mid-1970s and got a great deal of flack for it, largely because it was also in the midst of nature-nurture questions and whether there were particular connotations of Ed Wilson, even after his death, continues to have pot shots taken at him unfairly, I would say, in many ways. But Ed Wilson was also writing on the book. He's a person who uses the term biodiversity in 1986 in a conference in Washington, D.C. The word conservation biology itself was doing the rounds from about 8 years earlier. But Wilson was writing books like Biophilia, and another one, which is this, The Diversity of Life. And what I've done over here is to show you 3 different covers. And these 3 different covers point to different aspects of that diversity. You can see plant diversity, you can see insect diversity, and well, a number of species over here with snakes and birds on the other one, just to give you an example as we look at biodiversity. I'm going to take one of them. The diversity of life, and this is, again, Ed Wilson, but there's a reason I've put this man over here, J.B.S. Haldane, famous geneticist, embryologist, biologist of various stripes, eventually persuaded by Marxism and dies Indian, moving here in the latter years of his life. And remarkable for many aphorisms, which I still remembered. And one of them was, and you can see over here, which insects are seen the most. And so apparently he was asked once what all this diversity in the world told us about the mind of the creator. And Haldane immediately responded an inordinate fondness for beetles. And this is, and so you can actually see this. Beetles just essentially cover much of the terrestrial Earth as we know it. And it's interesting, years after that statement was made, you've got on the right side, Brian Farrell's paper out of Harvard, Inordinate Fondness Explained, why are there so many beetles? And it's just simply a matter of how they've been able to exploit a series of niches, both as beetles and weevils. It's the Coleoptera, the order in which it happens. And this is just to show you some of the largest insect and orders. And since you can see the bottom, you can see just how many species there are, with the Coleoptera right over here at 400,000 species. But the Lepidoptera, the moths and butterflies, are 175,000, just to give you an example. And recently, Rituja, who's here, and I presented a paper on the Eastern Ghats, and we were looking, and this is on a paper from 1913 on representative anopheline species in the neighborhood of then Vizagapatam, Vishakhapatnam. And we were looking at, and we were considering this in light of incidences of malaria at different altitudes from 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, in keeping with what some of my current interests are, which are in biodiversity in time past, and the recording of it, most recently in a book of mine, which I shall talk about. But this is very different from what we think about as biodiversity. Here's something from Erviculum, where we've got the Nilgiri tar, or Neelapatan, close to Krea, where I teach, where we've got flamingos and heronries, mixed heronries and the like. But this is what I was talking about. This is the kind of work I do right now on the fauna of British India, where which was the most ambitious effort in trying to record the biodiversity of a region, of a regional fauna, 82 volumes, 81 and a half volumes, if you will. One is a half volume because of the continuation by over 61 years by 33 authors from the protozoa to the mammalia. And that is a kind of work that continues to be inspirational in many ways. But then we ask questions like now, how many species are there? And this is from Biology for a Changing World, and this is a textbook that we used, approximately 1.5 million estimated eukaryotic species, those with cell membrane, 8.7 million, and you can see what the animals, and we'll come to these where protists, archaea, bacteria, plants, and fungi are in various proportions. More recently, and that's from a 2014 book, you've got this from Biodiversity and Wildlife, life on Earth dominated by plants, which make up 82% of global biomass. Now, the animal kingdom makes up just 0.4, of which humans account for just 0.01. 86% of life in terrestrial environments, 13% deep subsurface, and just 1% in marine environments. Now, if there were 1.5 in the next 7 years, they've identified over 2 million species, but the estimates vary. And when I was doing conservation biology, they would say there could be up to 30 million species and perhaps even more. And the tropics, of course, and this is no surprise, are home to some of the most diverse and unique ecosystems. Part of this, of course, and Darwin, of course, would speak a great deal to this from his famous finches, the fact that you're really trying to exploit in a place various kinds of niches, and so you have adaptive radiation from places where you can do this. Somebody is asking a lot of questions. Okay. Great. So here's some of the examples. Here are some of the types of fungi that you have: chytrids, zygomycetes, basidiomycetes, ascomycetes, and glomeromycetes. Here's some of the plant diversity. I'm not going to go into great depth. It's just trying to give you a sense of the diversity that's out there. In India, this is divided into various floristic groups. I use this because it was employed so often when I was growing up, and that is where you had tropical wet evergreen forests, semi-evergreen forests, tropical thorn, tropical dry evergreen, and the like. Champion and State, picking up from Champion's own work in 1936. and animal diversity, which you have over here, with levels of relatedness in this increasingly important field called phylogenetics, which has been dominated much of molecular thinking in. The other area where we actually see this is in terms of food chains and food web. A person called Raymond Lindemann was responsible for this and looking at this from the point of view of what you expect to see up a chain in terms of what's eating what and how much of what can be eaten and how many can be at any particular trophic level as it's considered in terms of aesthetics. And so what you do have are various kinds of pyramids in terms of numbers. And you expect that you will find that there will be more herbivores than there are carnivores, and top carnivores will be fewer than those that they may eat. Pyramids of mass, how much of it is there actually occupied? You can see in terms of age, even if these seem small, there are lots of it. And finally, the energy that's available at every level going up. And so when you study ecosystems ecology, these are very much the kinds of interrelationships that we're considering. And there are various kinds of species. We've got dominant species. One of the most important is the level of the keystone species. The keystone species, where if you were to remove that one species, even if it's not numerically significant in terms of numbers, its removal can affect the system, the ecosystem in question, in very delicate fashion. Now, where do I come into all of this, and what is my story? Growing up in all of these places, Iraq, Libya, and then the United States, where Nina and I overlapped, and later France and England along the way, my experience of biodiversity was tremendous because it was so different, both, I mean, in the Palearctic, the Nearctic, and the old we'll talk about various zones. My mother got my sister sitting and cut out little pieces, photographs from a Reader's Digest article, which were most endangered higher vertebrates. And so as a child, the grizzly, the imperial north fox, the imperial eagle, the oryx, the gorilla, and polar bears, if you will. So that, however, at the same time, the pets I actually had were Drosophila, because my father was bringing these back from his laboratory because he was a geneticist and finally agreed. I moved to the Madras Christian College, which had 365 acres of scrub jungle. A number of species would go through my room, like these scorpions and saw-scale vipers, pipistrelles and cobras and shikras and crested honey buzzards and the like. And this is where I got much of my blooding, studying sequentially the birds and then the butterflies of campus, even as 14 species of snake went through my room. But at the same time, I was working on sea turtles. And this is where I was a secretary of the Sea Turtle Conservation Network with people who are now very dear friends. And a consequence of which was something to which Mina referred, and that was a musical called Olive, which we did in 1994, and I have to say well before Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, as well as Finding Nemo. But it was essentially trying to see whether through the media of music and theater, we could actually talk about what was a Schedule 1 or endangered species that was coming to the coast of Madras at that point in time. And we would walk a stretch of beach, a Student Sea Turtle Conservation Network, from Besanagar to Nilangarai, and collect eggs, which we would move to a hatchery. And so essentially, one of the outcomes of that was this particular musical. Moving to the States, I worked with Deborah Waller and Joseph Daniel. And what was really interesting with Joe Daniel, on the same day, I would work on white rhinos in terms of visual acuity tests, and then go and work with Debbie Waller on termites. And so issues of scale were very real on those particular days from rhinos and termites on the same day. My work actually, however, was on Lepidoptera, and I was invited to work with Naomi Pierce at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology, or these are museums of natural history. And she was working on mutualisms, but an interesting system whereby some caterpillars that were tended by ants evolutionarily figured out a way to cheat, whereby they would secrete just enough of pheromone to go in, to be taken to the ant nest, and then systematically chomp the ant brood up. But they could not actually, the ants could not tell. And this was this group, the Militania, this carnivorous group of caterpillars on which I worked. And I'm showing this again from the point of view of just some of those elements to which I've drawn attention earlier, the notion of the food chain, the notion of connections, and what it is that these butterflies are eating, how they're tended, and how crucial in many ways these networks are in terms of work. So then we come down to another question. If we're talking about biodiversity, and this plagues people who are doing biology, it's a question of what is a species? And right now I should talk about something that does come up, and it is a question of whether you're a lumper or a splitter. Are you trying to name as many species as possible based on characteristics that others will consider trivial and will say, oh, come on, they're really part of the same group. And this has major implications because sometimes in the lumping process, it's possible to lose key populations because later it will be found that they actually may have been quite divergent. But it's an important question. So in our traditional systems, we know this is how it works: a kingdom, a phylum, a class, an order, a family, genus, and species, and you move from the very general to the very specific. For example, Drosophila melanogaster, where the kingdom is Animalian, you go through segmented legs for the Arthropoda, class and sector, order Diptera, 2 wings, and then in the family Drosophilidae, Drosophila, and then species, including both names, Drosophila melanogaster, simply because if you just went with melanogaster, it could be like this: musculus, musculus, where musculus is the house mouse and Balaenoptera musculus is the blue whale. And so there's a major difference in terms of scale, which is why the generic name is also important. So the first kinds of major classification, such as we know and which coheres with the modern scientific project, would have been given by Aristotle. And his system was essentially plants, soft stems, woody stems, several woody stems, and animals, air dwellers, water dwellers, land dwellers, and that was very much the size of the stem and based upon where they lived. And with animals, it would be those with red blood, without red blood, and then there would be those who were viviparous that were giving birth directly versus oviparous. And then he would break them into whales, fishes, birds, because he couldn't quite figure out what to do with them, but he decided they were different. The notion of the two continued with the person who's still revered as this major pioneering figure. Some would call him father in that often now denigrated term of fathers of anything. But yeah, Carolus Linnaeus, who really instantiated in the modern world the sense of the binomial system of nomenclature through again, two-kingdom classification, Plantae and Animalia, through these really important books, one in 1753, Species Plantarum, and in 1758, Systema Naturae. And that's where, and that has continued in many ways. It's continued for a good long while, although we'll see other systems along the way. Georges Cuvier in France was quite thought differently, and he said, you should not look so much at structure, but function, and so came up with, and he's a person, by the way, who divided living elephants from those that had gone before, mastodons, mammoths versus the elephants that live today. It's like Elephas maximus over here, the Asian or the Indian elephant, versus the mammoth, long since extinct. But he's the one who came up with the notion of functional integration and divided animals into various forms, the vertebrata, the articulata, the mollusca, and the radiata, and they all were made differently, and he would have believed that these were designed and these were created differently. So it's just to say that taxonomy itself and how we understand diversity is by no means straightforward. there are different ways of thinking about how you classify, and I can go a great deal more into this, but this is merely a quick take through, and this is part of that system of QBA. Ernst Haeckel, the man who introduces the word ecology, who says a discourse on the home, oikos being home in Greek, came up with what he considered a three system, where he had the plantae and the animalia, but others that were more, which are simpler in many ways, the sponges, for example, and he said we should consider other forms. Robert Whittaker, nearly a century later, came up with a five-kingdom system, by which point he said, do you have a some do you not? Do you, I said, you may, but do you have a nucleus, or do you have bounded membranes? And this became a very important difference along the way. So you had breakups into the Monera, the protists, the plants, the animals, and the fungi, to which I drew attention earlier. And then in 78, you had Calvus, who came in, and he said, no, there are major differences. And so where you had plants and animals really dominating much of thinking, they now became branches in one group called the eukaryotes, the eukarya. You had this old group, as they were called, much more primitive, called the archaea, and finally the bacteria. And so this was the major division into domains that really changed the face of how biodiversity was really being viewed. And so the truth is we still tend to look in the main at these, but I'm drawing attention to this to say that biodiversity is so much more. And it is important that we not lose sight of that even as we celebrate biodiversity. One major element in this was a man called, change in this line of thinking was a man called Willy Hennig. And he came up with a notion called cladistics, where you're saying you're simply looking at how organisms are associated with each other based upon traits. And you say, can you trace ancestry back to a particular ancestor? And so this is breaking away very much from a number of the lines of thinking that occurred earlier. This is just one example of how you do it. And now increasingly, this is happening using molecular techniques. It was done originally with morphological techniques, but now you're using both mitochondrial DNA or nuclear DNA or chloroplast DNA. And this is having a tremendous impact in how systematics or phylogeny or taxonomy, all these terms that are so related to each other, are being considered. Is it possible to find species in museums looking at the DNA of them and say, well, this is somewhat different from this? And so the implications are huge. All of this needs to be seen in the light of what we call the geological timescale. And this is largely broken up, and I will say there was a Proterozoic, and then from about 542 million years ago, you had the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. And you can see what happens in all of these. You have the laying down of life, and doing biology, you will know me. The Devonian is when you had this, the fish really taking off, and in the Pennsylvania, Mississippi, in the Carboniferous gymnosperms, or the groups that belong to pines and firs and all of that. The Mesozoic dominated by the dinosaurs, and the Cenozoic is when mammals really start to take off in a big way. Now, the question is, can you see this as an age? So for example, this might be considered the age of reptiles. And so you say, is there such a thing as the age of reptiles? And one of the professors for whom I was a teaching fellow, a remarkable figure called Stephen Jay Gould, said, no, it has always been the age of bacteria. And so again, I'd like us to think about what dominates in our mind and what really may be the case in many ways when we think about biodiversity again. So here we are again at the geological timescale, and you can actually see elements where there are these red lines, and these red lines point to what are called mass extinctions. And the reason I'm drawing attention to mass extinctions over here, and you can see them, we don't have to bother about the names. I'll point to two major ones, and there's a reason for that, is because when you ask the question, how did we get here? I think it's important for us to know, how did they get there? And if we're looking at extinctions across time, the point is that there have been perturbations for living kind since living kind's been around. And it is important for us to foreground that in some senses, to think about the now vis-a-vis then. This, for example, was the largest, they say that, the mother of all extinctions. 96% of all marine life was supposed to have gone out, 70% of terrestrial life, where there were largely anoxic situations, right? The one that we know very tremendously is anoxic, that is when oxygen really went down, is the Cretaceous Tertiary, or about 65 million years ago. The other one is about 255 million, 250 to 255 million years ago, the Permian Triassic. But the Cretaceous Tertiary is what really takes out the major dinosaurs. And there are some dinosaurs that have lasted beyond it, and those are the birds. But this is a major one, and again, it becomes important because such a dominant life form, at least as we would consider biodiversity, disappeared. But now we're moving into another time, and we're talking about where we are getting, and that is what they call the Sixth Extinction. There have been 5, and Elizabeth Colbert won a Pulitzer for writing this book, The Sixth Extinction. And it's taking us into what people call the Anthropocene. A term that was introduced by Eugene Stoner in the 1970s and popularized by a Nobel Prize-winning chemist called Paul Crutzen. And the reason it becomes important is because this is the first time that the kinds of changes we are seeing can be attributed to a single species, and that is humankind. So you've got anthropos, and the word scene for an epoch in geological time, and it's the most recent geological time period. And you can see you've got the Pleistocene, this is just recent area, the Holocene, and we'll come to that in a second, and then this known as the Anthropocene. So the Holocene is approximately 11,000 years before the present, okay? And here's a book some of you may have read, Sapiens. And what he says, what Yuval Noah Harari says at its first, in the introduction, right at the very beginning, in chapter 1, is how physics has come to characterize certain elements 13.5 billion years ago, 2,000 years, atoms coming to being into molecules, chemistry, 3.8 billion years ago, molecules combined to form particularly large intricate structures called organisms, and this is where our biodiversity story starts. And then 70,000 years ago, we've got Homo sapiens starting to form elaborate structures called cultures, and this is where history comes in many ways. And I'm not going into the story of how Homo sapiens outcompeted other forms of the genus Homo, but it's important to draw attention to this to try and take a stab at why we've gotten where we've gotten. Now, Samuel Langhorne Clemens, Mark Twain, wrote this wonderful essay called Was the World Made for Man? And so I'm going to draw attention to this, and he was responding to Alfred Russel Wallace, who co-propounded the theory of natural selection. But here is this. I'm going to read this. Such is the history of it. Man has been here 32,000 years. That it took 100 million years to prepare the world for him is proof that this was what it was done for. I suppose it is. I don't know. If the Eiffel Tower were now representing the world's age, the skin of paint on the pinnacle knob at its summit would represent man's share of that age, and anybody would perceive that that skin is what the tower was built for. I reckon they would. I don't know. And so this is trenchant in many ways in terms of exactly what hubris is for a particular species and how it's really been analogized the way Twain has done it, to say, is this really the reason? Now let's look at the population explosion of the world in data. Now here's the here's what's frightening. In the year 1800, the population of the world was 1 billion. In 220 years, it stands at 7.7. And so how do we get to this particular point? And this is why the notion of the Anthropocene becomes really significant. Longer lifespans, the Industrial Revolution. Where do you place that spike? Is it within the Industrial Revolution? Is it with the baby boom? What is it? And these are important questions to ask as we try and tackle what my charge in many ways is to the topic that I've been given. And what we are seeing, anthropogenic, that which is caused by the anthropos, are carbon emissions, mass migration of fauna, massive rates of extinction, shifts from natural to artificial selection. We are breeding to our ends, and creation of non-biodegradable synthetic polymers. In 1962, Rachel Carson wrote about the dangers of pesticides, particularly DDT. And this is her opening page is the sedge is withered from the lake and no birds sing. And she wrote a book in No Birds Sing. And this is I'm bringing this back to the notion of the food chain and the food web. But if the DDT is being taken at the lowest level of that trophic chain, and then it accumulates as fish eat a considerable number of this, you have increasing concentrations of the pesticides as you go up the trophic chain. And this is what Rachel Carson was writing about. And this was back in 1962, 61, 62. We have other implications. Here's Dolly and Ian Wilmot. You've had major moves into stem cell research. And this has huge implications. Are human beings effectively playing God? Is it possible to do this? What are the implications of this? The completion of the human genome sequence in the year 2000. And the question of, once we know this, what do we do with it? We're dealing with other situations as well. We're seeing that we're looking at the outbreak of a number of diseases. This is another area in which I work, the Spanish flu or the great influenza of 1918, well below our current crisis, and well before this. But what is significant and alarming is that while a full 1/2 of all Nobels in physiology and medicine in the first 10 years of its existence went to immunology or germ theory, the new kids on the block, at least from the 1980s, have all been viral, not bacterial. And the Spanish flu is an example of that, and how are we going to respond in many ways. And this is one, the Indian scientists' response to COVID. I spoke to them from this place 2 years ago. We were looking at these particular comparisons and saying, what is it that we do? Where are we? How do we respond to these particular incidents, many of which appear to be of our making? And what might these implications be for the nature of the biodiversity that we are seeing? And on that, thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for taking us through this wonderful journey of where we are today from what we started. Are there any questions? The floor is open. I'm just unmuting everyone.
Is over a very short period of time, man, sapiens, Homo sapiens, whatever we wish to call them, have come to dominate and control all the elements of the environment that are around. So how, coming back to environment knowledge, how sustainable is this the way we are going? I think
I'm muted again. $1 million question. I think that in some senses, our ability to create is outstripping our ability to deal with those acts of creation, not least in the computational world, and in the computer world. And I think that is, and the implications are massive. Population is a huge issue, and I don't think we can sustain this by any population biology measure that we've got. And the point is buy-in. The reason that I even raised the elements about climate change at the beginning was to talk about just how intractable these situations are. Now, one of the problems is if you're looking at the industrialized world saying, committing to cutting emissions, what the developing world is saying in many ways, especially those that are increasingly assertive, those countries are saying, why shouldn't we benefit from the gains that the industrialized world has had for so long, not least piggybacking upon colonialism? That is what Robin Mugabe is functionally saying. I may disagree with Mugabe for a lot of other things, but he's making a good point. And it is, and so when Alok Sharma says what he does, if India is saying, well, how do we get to where we want to get along the way? What can the countries of the industrialized North actually say without sounding completely hypocritical? And yet, if the countries if countries like China and India do not exhibit some level of prudence, we're all doomed. So it's a really difficult one.
Okay, let me put a question to you that you wouldn't, any explorer, teacher, researcher wouldn't like. Put a date on us. When are we finishing?
It's really hard to say. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I've wondered whether we're going to see the next century out.
Okay.
And I mean, seriously, I'm wondering where we're going to be and how at this level of growth, unless we start plateauing. And is that plateauing going to happen because of density dependent issues? Is war going to be a major concern? I mean, we're just looking at what's unfolding with Russia right now, right? And what are the implications for that, for example, in terms of oil for Europe? Now, Europe's saying we're going to go off in many ways, but how quickly can you do that? Especially now with something as fraught as the Russian-Finnish border, for example. So, but I don't know. I mean, I would say it would be, we really have to do something remarkable if we're going to last the next century out.
Okay. On that positive note, I'm going to go around the room. Mrs. Nilmara Raghavan, would you have anything to say or ask? Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much, John, for that excellent presentation. But, as I was going through your slides, it also concerned me that the trend today with anything is to be proactive and be scared or stress the others also because we are scared. I don't know. Because I am no way a biologist nor a researcher in that field. But the general trend, the other day I went to the doctor and he said, go for these tests because you are 58. I said, unless something troubles me, I don't want to go find out what's wrong. There's nothing wrong as of now. And he said, that's the trend to be precautionary. Maybe, I don't know, maybe that's the way we are looking at things around us and getting scared and in the name of proactiveness, do things that may not be even right. I mean, I've been thinking and debating within myself. I've never, spoken about this, but it's just a concern that are we trying to say in this, some things are natural, cannot be controlled by human nature. We have to go with the flow. That's what we've been understanding or reconciling to, facts that have been happening across the globe. I'm not talking of my locale alone. I don't know if we are acting proactively and trying to, put a fear in people. It's good in a way to be careful, to be mindful of ways to nurture nature. All that is good, but do we have to really scare them? I don't know. I may be wrong. Yeah.
Look, I mean, let me start by saying I'm typically not cynical, and I would love to see, for us to be able to say, yeah, business is normal. And I don't necessarily mean business in the sense of enterprise, but just going about what we do. But it's not as if there haven't been denialists, right? I mean, just look at the anti-vax movement at this point in time, not least with people like Novak Djokovic, right? And over here you're saying, well, is there information? Who controls the information? What happens? Does this fall within the national bounds of what can occur? Is it worthwhile taking risks? What is a risk that you can take? And just over COVID, you've seen how different reactions have been across the world. I'm not entirely certain that there is a one size fits all. I do know that, say, in the United States, where I lived for several years, very often you ended up taking a lot more tests than perhaps were necessary. This might be different from the National Health Service in Britain, which might deal with it differently. But then over there, you have it nationalized in a way that you don't with private doctors. And so those are different systems, again, with which you're dealing. There was an interesting bet taken by a man called Julian Simon at the University of Maryland and a British ecologist called Norman Myers. Sorry, not Norman Myers, but Norman Myers wrote about it, but with a California-based biologist who had written The Population Extinction and the Bomb and Extinction, called Paul Ehrlich. And they had said, one was an economist, the other one a biologist, and they said, will the price of a number of particular resources go up or down over a set of years? And the economist won because of a series of perturbations in the market more than anything else, but this may not have lasted much longer. So the question also is, what is your time frame? And that's a hard one, right? Because you say, is this a short-term response? Is it in the longer term? And from an evolutionary perspective, in the longer term, we'll all end up in the gutter anyway. But that's a very long-term answer. But do I think that it's worthwhile being cautious? Yes, yes, and yes. Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Raghavan. We now have Christopher Patak.
I've been looking at a number of your questions, actually. Would you like to ask them directly, Mr. Patak, or?
You're muted, Chris.
Okay, so my questions are around whether the Holocene is really the Anthropocene. So essentially 11,000 years ago, across America anyway, the United States, the largest animals disappeared. The saber-toothed tiger, the mastodon, so many things happened at the beginning of what we recognize as the Holocene. And across Australia, where I did my research back in the 1970s, I studied the interaction of Australian Aborigines with the environment there, and we recognized that around about 80,000 years ago, when the human population arrived in Australia, the same thing happened. The major animals disappeared. So I see that we started creating major differences across the landscape a longer period than what we're recognizing as the Anthropocene right now. And my second question, I really am taken by Ruderman's thesis about the way we changed the climate drastically, started to do that around about the end of the past climate maximum. And I'd just like to have your comment on that as we move forward, because we're certainly recognizing that 200 years ago, we did change the world with our use of fossil fuels. But no, the trends would seem to have started before then.
I completely agree. In fact, one of the places where we play, when I talk to my environmental studies students, is to say, where will you place the golden spike? Will it be coincident with the top of the Holocene? Will it be with the Industrial Revolution? Or will it be just after the Second World War? And when will it, and when do you actually see these? I have to ask, are you friends with Tim Flannery?
I know Tim Flannery. Yes, I do.
Well, the reason I ask is because he's writing the Future Readers, right? And we that particular story, and it also, in some ways, I mean, it's controversial, right? Because it certainly throws out, I mean, questions the notion of what might have been called the noble savage in many ways. And you say, well, ultimately, human beings will be human beings, and human beings will continue to do what human beings do, irrespective. And well, look, the question, I mean, let's take Hardin's paper, again, somebody with whom I don't always agree, but it's an influential paper nonetheless about the tragedy of the commons. And the question is there a tipping point beyond which it really becomes stark? And I would say that after the Industrial Revolution, that's what started to change. Yes, you're absolutely right that from the Holocene, there was certainly the element of anthropos, humankind, and as a concept, but then you can say, what then is anthropos? 80,000 years ago, and then 42,000 years ago, we were also dealing with Neanderthals and Denisovans. So those were other, so the question is what you're considering human at this particular point in time. Are you only talking about Homo sapiens?
Is that a question to me? I would think, yeah, Homo, the genus Homo, as it comes out, yes, is basically the Holocene. And the other thing I would say is something about the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere we're obviously pushing it towards what it was 65 million years ago, when obviously humanity, but there were mammals there at that time, and mammals did survive through that. So you know, whether how humans survive into that future, we'll wait to be seen. I think some of us will survive. There may be a major extinction of a loss of many of the humanity during that time. As we move forward, as the recent writer Kim Stanley Johnson, is it? Anyway, predicted as a future where we'd lose a great amount of humanity because of the rise in temperature.
No, I agree. And like they say in war, I dare say there'll be a lot of collateral damage, and those would be other species that we take with us, and that would be a tragedy. But yes.
Chris and John, the both of you are slightly above our normal common intelligence level. So you guys have taken off somewhere else. So I'm trying to bring it back to where my level of intelligence is. Okay, so we'll probably go on to the next person who might have a question. One of my most vociferous members in ESRAG who has an opinion about a lot of things and actually puts it into action. Dr. Deepankar Adya, would you have something to say?
Hear you now a little bit.
Yeah, no, actually, Professor John has explained so lucidly. It only gave us the impression that we are heading towards a point of no return, and until and unless we all act very proactively, it will be difficult to really do something about the things what he has talked about. So we need to act fast. That's it.
I could not agree more. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I cannot agree more. I will say, however, that when the Society for Conservation Biology started, Michael Sule, who was then the president, said, we believe that we are still in time. And I cannot overemphasize the need for hope. And I think that if we're all going to throw up our hands and say this is it, then we can start counting the number of conferences we're going to have before we can't. But I think that it's important for us to say, what can we do? And I think even if Alok Sharma at the very end, the fact that there were figures being identified, models being tried, suggests that there are answers, but what it needs is will. And the tragedy will be if the answers are not tried. And who's to blame for that?
Good call to ourselves. And next we have Kurola from Hong Kong, who's got a hand up and has a question. Yep.
So now I'm unmuted. Thank you for a very thought-provoking talk. I liked in particular what you said about Mugabe basically saying, oh, you developed nations, because there is a very high level of arrogance that is perceived by developing countries to say, oh, you guys, you're carbon neutral. Why are you carbon neutral? Because you shipped all your garbage to China, Malaysia, India, Philippines, you name the country, you shipped it to there. So I do understand some resentment from that side, to say, well, you've had, your industrial revolution, you had all the consumerism you wanted, and now you're telling us to slow down because you messed it up and did it too fast. And I experience this every day because I'm working hands-on within ESRAG and within the Preserve Planet Earth within Rotary. So we're talking to educated, enlightened people. And when you ask to make a change, everybody is for it until the moment comes where you say, but it is you who has to change. You have to change your habits. And that's where, resistance comes in. So my question is, how do we get the message across to each individual that it is not just about your personal comfort, but it is about the survival of the species, basically?
A lot of it, I think, is going to be political. It's really interesting, Chris is here, and as to what's happened right now in Australia. The fact that there's been a change in government, that but one has to see what the commitment to the environment is going to be over there. But there are already things that are being said by Labour and by Albanese, but that's at one level. It's about what's being said. The question is, can you carry a country? And again, I wonder if in some senses we're going to be driven into it if we don't listen. And I think, one of the things that Julian Simon used to say is that we will always find a way. The same economist of whom I spoke, now deceased, but he's the one, and when he took the bet with Paul Ehrlich, he says that we are inventive enough to find other ways to get around it. The question is, how long can we continue to use ingenuity to circumvent problems and resources? And I don't know the answer to that one. I do believe in human ingenuity, but I think there is a danger of hubris. And this is where that balance somehow has got to be reached. I also say that Chris wrote about with the fact that we have hope, we also can be conservationists, but yes, and I agree with that in principle. But you need to be able to carry the body politic, so to speak. It's not just merely people at the top of the chain, right? So,
John, I have a question here. It's about, we keep talking about awareness. Awareness is nice as long as you're giving the common people information that ends with an exclamation mark. But how much of it actually is a call to action? It's not like I'm finding this difficulty when I get down to field work that people know. You don't have to tell them, but what are they doing about it? How does that change happen?
Well, I mean, what are the incentives? I think so much of this is based upon incentives and what you're offering people. If for a seminar, the pizza and the wine and cheese are going to make a difference in how many people turn up in some senses. I mean, it's there. I mean, and that's a very practical point, but it's yeah, they do, and people just say, okay, that's what you do. But it's one has to point to the fact that there has to be something in it for us. It just seems inveterate to our nature to want to see that there's something. And so the question is, what are practical incentives that can happen? And the other issue, of course, is how you're doing this across class, economic class. I mean, a lot of people here have had the luxury to think about these issues, right? What about the people that aren't here? How are we speaking to them? What are the incentives there? Why should they care? And I think it's important. Why, say, for example, when Alpha started killing rhinos in Assam, why did it happen? Part of it was because it was a statement against the Indian government. Now, this is not a major argument about the need for the protection of rhinos. It is a very different angle that was being considered. What do you do in cases like that when wildlife is actually being caught in literal crossfire? So I'm just giving you an example to say that it's not just about this. There are so many variables to consider. And I mean, if there's a certain level of contentment, and I honestly believe if there's a certain level of perceived justice, be it in terms of parity or what it is, that we do have a fighting hope. But as long as those inequities continue to obtain, then a lot of this will be peripheral to a lot of people's thinking.
Okay, I think Mrs. Nirmala Raghavan's got a question. And before I put her up, I'm going to warn your student, Ruth, because I want an outside Rotary perspective on what we've been going on and on for the last 90 minutes. So Ruth, be prepared to come on next. Right now, it's Mrs. Nirmala Raghavan.
We're talking about incentives, the awareness campaigns, which really don't come into action. They come for the meets and then maybe it's forgotten. But incentives might help. But a word or a law from not just from our governments, but institutions like Harvard or from the West, which we regard more for these things, can make a law or can make a big noise about this so that people across the globe really understand what the enormity is.
Is that, I don't know. I mean, I'd like to believe that were true. I'd like to believe that there could be calls to the better angels of our nature. And perhaps there are examples like South Africa in the long term and the fact that apartheid no longer continues to obtain over there. And that's a level of hope. But on the other hand, what are the messages that are being sent to strong men? And I use the word man in particular because they all tend to be men at this point in time, in particular places around the world. What has global outrage really changed in particular countries? And I mean, places like Harvard get discounted in its own country. And that's very often because there is a level of anti-intellectualism that obtains in much of the United States, these universities notwithstanding. So I'm concerned. I mean, I'm not sure that anything's changing in Hong Kong right now. And I know I had one question from Hong Kong over here. For example, politically, despite the fact that there's been so much outrage. So on that one, I may not be quite as sanguine.
We'll read we'll ask Ruth to step in now, and after her, we'll have Dipankar. Come on. Part of this whole session is making people who don't want to talk. So,
Okay, finally unmuted.
yeah.
I'm not a student. I studied in college with John, and yeah. Yes, and I'm also not a stranger to Rotary. Both my parents were in Rotary for many, all our life. I mean, growing up, every Friday we were there with the Rotary and Innervale, but in Vellore. But yeah, but anyway, just because I have to say something, I think that, as like the common people, kind of think we're saving the planet, we're sorting our garbage, we're switching from plastic, we are going all organic, especially right now I'm in Kathmandu in Nepal, and it's all farmers market, and we're doing something. But I really don't think the impact of what we do is much. I think the problem is was created more by on a much bigger scale, like with policies and government. And, so I understand we're all desperately doing something, turning off lights, since we were in school, picking up litter. We also went with John for, doing the turtle walks and, things like that. But I don't really think that the answer will be what individuals do, whatever it is. I think it has to be only coming from government and policies. Things like plastic and all, yeah, we do that. You just have to bring in laws. You have to actually implement those things. There have to be not incentives as much as what is the opposite, punishments or whatever to governments. And, so they need to stop doing what they're doing. They need to stop the dumping. They need to stop creating, garbage or whatever it is. And I think that is more thing. What we can do as people, of course, is to kind of talk to the governments. And sometimes we, like he said about Australia, sometimes it has to be only, political will. And I don't really think it's individual people who can, although we will continue to do it. And I think what the previous person who had spoken, talking about scaring people, I don't know how it is in some of the other schools, but in the school where my kids studied and all, there's some kids are really coming up with a kind of, psychological issues, about fear of all this climate change, and we like to tell them oh, the world is going to come to an end or whatever it is. But I don't know how positive that is. That ends up kind of, on one hand, they might feel like there's no point. On the other hand, they can get very cynical like Greta, right? And angry. And it's that anger should be there. But yeah, I just think it's more on the government. And then we as, as people, we need to only talk to our governments more than anything else. So, okay, I'll unmute myself.
So, policy change, environmental justice. John, you had something to say. I'm so sorry.
No, not sorry. Go ahead. No, I'm thinking about movements like the Arab Spring. I'm thinking about the Occupy movement. I'm thinking again about what's happening in Hong Kong. If we had governments that were democratic across the board and truly representative, I would agree with you in a heartbeat. But the fact is that it ain't necessarily so. Why is it that, people may disagree with, say, the Naxalite movement or the Maoist movement, but from where did they rise? The danger of consistently top-down approaches is the fact that relatively few make the rules for the many. And unless it is a two-way street, what do we do? Let's take one example. Take Afghanistan right now. If we were to observe what the government is doing over there and say that works, then where do we stand on issues of human rights? Where do we stand on issues of the play out of polity over there? And And so in some sense, I'll turn that back to you, Ruth, and say, I'm happy to agree with this, but how will this be effectuated across the board, since we're talking about a global crisis with different levels of authority in different places, given that yours appears to be somewhat top-down in terms of enactment? Thank you.
A little bit of it started with me repeatedly saying common man, like I'm not common man. So let us, what started in Naxalbari for what and where it went is another story altogether. So to decide between the carrot and the stick, Dipankar.
I agree with Ruth, and I was about to tell that we require a very mass awareness, as I was talking earlier, so that we can impress on the government. Ultimately, it is the political will which rather accelerate any actions. So we need to, from our side, we need to work for mass awareness so that at one point of time, we can really impress on the government to take action the way we want, or the environmentalists want for this. That's the thing.
All right.
Valid point there. And I think we've taken a lot of everyone's time. I'd love to continue this forever, but then I guess time's come for us to stop talking and start taking action. What do you say, John?
I completely agree. And I'm very grateful to to you, Arun, and to Meenad for having me and inviting me in the first place on such an important day in many ways. And to all of you for the questions you have to ask. I see what, thank you, Mary. I see what Chris has had to say about revisiting Thomas Kuhn on the principles of the paradigm shift. And this is an interesting idea that came out in 1962 in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where you say that essentially what seems to be the data that you get no longer seem to fit the model that you have. And so you need to try and think of another way. How these paradigms work politically remains to be seen. John Agar, who heads, or for a long time did head the Science and Technology and Society, or Science and Technology Studies program at UCL, University College London, has come up with the notion of the working world. And the working world suggests that there are problems or challenges, and the manner in which we address it constitutes that working world in which we may have abstractions and models. And this could be anything from civil society, the administration, to science. And here's a civil society problem, perhaps, if you will, or challenge, and how we do it remains to be seen. I forget his name, but there's somebody who worked on cleaning up a beach in Bombay, and that one person, and he started a real movement, and a number of people came to join him. And if we can, by peer inspiration, do that, that's a place to start. And I think that in many ways, these are the stories that need to be told. And if there are governments that will listen and see them and not try and seize the moment for themselves, but give due credit where it should go, and can work in conjunction, then maybe it's possible, Ruth. But that will need to happen on a two-way street, right? Along a two-way street. That's where it is.
I'll stop recording and open the floor for any discussions or any comments.